Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be back with you today for the third meeting of the Community Advisory Task Force for Clackamas County's Climate Action Plan. I'm very excited that you're joining us for this third meeting. We have a lot of exciting things planned for today, and so we want to dive right in. As we get underway, I do want to just take a moment to again acknowledge that our work in this project is concerned with lands where many tribes made their homes, including the Multnomah, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Wasco, Cowlitz, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Molalla, and many others. And their descendants continue to live and work in relationship with this land. The work that we do in this project seeks to honor these people who stewarded their environment. We made this acknowledgement in our last meeting as well, and encourage us to keep this in mind as the project unfolds. And with that, let's turn to the purpose for today's meeting. Next slide. So today we have a couple main purposes. We want to build some foundational understanding of our current picture for greenhouse gas emissions in the county, and also where we are headed under a business as usual or business as planned. And we want to be able to talk about how to make those data actionable for us. Next slide, please, Katie. We also have a few objectives, things that we want to have done by the end of the meeting today. First, we want to continue to build relationships with one another. And I will say it's been a pleasure reading those bios that have been submitted so far. It's been very helpful. So thank you to those that have submitted those. Another objective is that we want to make sure that we all have a decent understanding of the current reality through business as planned modeling, which we'll have a presentation on that from our consulting team. And we want to keep engaging with the prioritization criteria to prepare to review actions and put those criteria into use as we understand and select or create actions. So those are some high-level purpose and objectives items for the day. Next slide will give you a sense of the more detailed agenda that we're aiming for. Couple of notes for today. We're going to try to keep it light on you with the links. There should only be, Sarah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there should only be one link today that you need to deal with. We are going to be in this Zoom meeting room space for a big portion of the meeting, but also in breakout rooms a few times. One minor change to our agenda is that our consulting team is going to touch on some of the climate action plans they've done before, just to kind of give you a taste of what's coming up in our process. We are going to have a short break at 2:20. Today is really going to be a mix of group presentations, information sharing from the consulting team, and then small group discussion amongst ourselves to digest and practice applying information. And I'll note again, just for public record, that this meeting is being recorded. Are there any questions about the agenda or anything on our team, anything I've missed that folks need to interject with on the agenda? Okay, if not, let's go to the next slide. Just a reminder, we've seen these group operating agreements a couple of times. We're not going to take time to walk through them in detail. Garrett or Katie, if you would add these to chat just for reference, that would be very helpful. So folks can refer to them a little bit later if they need to. These operating agreements are expressing just how we agree to share this space and work together. And later in the meeting, we should be reviewing the collaborative conditions that you designed as agreements for how we'll collaborate with each other. We encourage you to please participate. All right, next slide, please. A couple of other housekeeping items before we get underway, which will be with introductions. Our work together is considered public record. So that means we're recording these meetings. We are going to be recording the breakout rooms. We are also, of course, taking notes, and those notes will be public record. Emails and text messages regarding our work are considered public record, as is the content that is posted on Basecamp our project information sharing site. When you're sending emails, we encourage you to copy Sarah Allison at the climate@clackamas.us email address on correspondence. That makes it very easy for us to track communication that is part of public record. Finally, as we said in the last meeting, all of these meetings are open to the public and include a public comment period. We're trying out today holding our meetings as a Zoom meeting instead of a Zoom webinar. And that means that members of the public may be side by side with us on the screen. So to help us keep track of each other, you have had, if you were a task force member, you have had the initials TFM added in front of your name in Zoom. If you are an observing member of the public, not on the CATF, we would ask that you turn off your video and remain muted until the time for public comment. We've reserved 10 minutes for that between 3:25 and 3:35. The length of individual comments will depend on interest and the amount of time we have available to us. Next slide, please. Okay, last sort of housekeeping item, just a reminder that if you haven't already logged into Basecamp, please do. We have heard, I believe, from a majority of you with bios and or pics or stories that connect you with this work. Thank you very much. Again, as I mentioned, it's been a pleasure to read that. And again, please reach out to Sarah via the climate@clackamas.us email if you need us to resend you an invite to Basecamp. And do we want that link here? No, maybe later. Okay, so with that, thank you all. And we're going to turn to introductions. Sarah?
Great. Thank you, Evan. So as Evan mentioned in our purposes, a part of what we're trying to do here today is to build relationships. And so as a part of that, we are going to do introductions in a slightly different way. So we are actually going to go into small groups to help build those relationships and get a little bit more time in small groups with each other. So we're going to break into 4 groups for the task members. And each group will include up to 6 people. We're not perfectly even because of the number of folks that we have, and at least one member of the project team will be in every group, and so that will be the person who's recording so that we have a record of all of these groups. And we're actually going to stay in the same group when we come back to small groups periodically throughout the meeting, so you'll have a chance to build on the relationships that you're starting here. So once we get into the rooms, please share our usual foundation information of name, pronouns, and organization or affiliation, and also a story about your name. And so each person should have just about a minute to share. And then we will come back out of breakout rooms at 1:20 and shift into the rest of our meeting. All right, so Garrett, feel free to shift us into breakout rooms.
All right, the rooms are open. You should be getting a notification to join your room.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that your brief conversation, just getting to know each other a little bit better, was fruitful and fun. We wanted to acknowledge, before we get into some additional presentations, I want to acknowledge that and appreciate that you are asking us a number of great questions. And so we have discussed those questions so far, and we will continue to do that. And on Basecamp is you'll find a Word document with a number of your questions posted so far and our answers. What you're seeing on the slide in front of you is just a few of the questions that you've asked. And so I want to spend just a moment to discuss them a little bit. Before we do that, I also wanted to just acknowledge that we'll do our best to answer questions that pertain to the development of this climate action plan and your role in it. There are probably going to be some times when we don't have all the information that you want or need. We'll try to be clear about that and honest. There's also a lot of knowledge and expertise in the room. And so in instances where we don't know the answer or can't find it, in addition to acknowledging our limitations, we would also encourage you to rely on each other for input and information, and encourage you to share from the knowledge and expertise you have. And you're not limited to doing that in this meeting. You can also share information on Basecamp. You can share information there about national, statewide, or regional policies, other pieces of information you think are relevant to the understanding of the group or the decisions that we'll ask the group to make. Basecamp is the county staff, we're sort of owning that site, but we're not going to moderate it. And again, everything on Basecamp would be considered public record. And if you have not participated in Basecamp yet and are looking for the invitation, again, please send a note to Sarah Allison. You can do that on chat or send her an email at the climate@clackamas.us address. So here are the few of the questions that we wanted to highlight today. One of the questions we got last time was, how are we thinking about involving tribes in this discussion? And our answer to that right now is that we interviewed members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde during the discovery phase of the project. And at that point, they declined to participate on the task force, but they did ask us to participate in a focus group or some other kind of participation when there are draft climate strategies to review. And so we have committed to convening with them at that time. The second question was, since Oregon City does not have a climate action plan, how will the emissions model include Oregon City emissions data? And our answer right now to that question is that the modeling that we've done includes emissions levels across the whole county, regardless of the status of city level planning. So our emissions model does include what we know about emissions, across the entire county, including Oregon City. The third question we wanted to highlight was, what is the low-hanging fruit that can impact both the climate and our community's resiliency? And our answer to that is that that's actually going to be part of what we are asking this task force to identify. There are certainly actions that we believe will have a climate benefit in reducing our emissions, and will also contribute to better preparedness and resiliency in the face of future climate change. And that's something that we want to be able to identify with you together. I note that there are some comments in the chat, a question from Mr. Street about why did the tribes decline to participate? And I'll say, I don't myself know the answer to that question, but we can take that question back. And if we have an answer to it, we can share, but we may not have an answer to that one. Okay. With that, I think we can go to the next slide. And just to note that if there was a question that you've asked recently that wasn't answered among these three, I encourage you to go back to Basecamp and look for our response there. Thanks. As we go to the next slide, we'll be handing it off to our consulting team.
So Katie, if you can actually stop screen share, Moria is gonna share content slides.
Okay, so for those of you whom I have not worked with before, my name is Moria Braun and I'm the lead analyst on this project. And I am here today with my colleague, Chris, and we have been working on the modeling of both the BAP and the preparations for the CATFs in the background. And it's been interesting and exciting work for us, and we're happy to be able to share with you today what we have already modeled to date, and to give you some information about what our modeling consists of, to answer your questions if you've got specific questions about the modeling, but most importantly, to give you a sense of what Clackamas County's emissions would look like or will look like in the case that you continue on largely a business as usual path, but also reflecting the fact that your population is expected to grow and that there are some changes already in the works and some policies that are in place that will result in some changes to emissions and to energy use and to building types and so on. So we want to walk you through that big picture and give you a high-level view of what your emissions would be like from now until 2050 if things continue on much as they are now, but with these plans in place that will affect them slightly. hope that was a reasonable introduction. It's hard to introduce a big topic like the business as usual modeling results. Okay, so we'll start by letting you know what your 2018 GHG inventory looked like, just as a reminder of the baseline that we started with, that we're going to be comparing everything else to. So your total county greenhouse gas emissions in 2018 amounted to 7.2 million metric tons of CO2e. So that's primarily CO2, carbon dioxide, but it also includes some methane and a few other gases, but primarily CO2 and methane that were emitted during that calendar year. The donut graph on the right gives you a sense of where those emissions came from. And you can see quite quickly that your consumption-based activities accounted for the largest portion of those emissions. So those would be purchases that you make within the county, but the products and services that you're purchasing, the production of those will have happened outside of the county, and then they will have had to be transported into the county and delivered to you. And so those consumption-based emissions account for all of that transportation and for the emissions in their original location as well. So that's a big piece, because it takes a lot more work to produce a product elsewhere and get it to you. And it also reflects the varying standards of emissions around the world when you purchase products that come from abroad. Your second largest area of emissions is transportation. So that would include all of your vehicles, as well as rail and airplane traffic, and even off-road traffic, so all of your construction vehicles and the city fleets and so on. So that's your second largest portion. You're noteworthy in that your waste emissions, so that would be things coming from your landfills and also from your wastewater treatment plants, that's very low. And that's a very good thing, because a lot of communities struggle to get their waste emissions down. But as you look at as we look forward in a few slides here, you'll notice that looks likely to change in the future if your population grows as you're expecting it to, and if additional measures aren't put in place to handle that additional waste. So we'll take a look at that as we proceed. Let's see, do I want to touch on any of the other areas? I don't think I will at this point in time, but I will give you time for questions at the end, and please also add them to the chat if you think of something along the way. All right, this slide is to fill you in on exactly what's included in that inventory, and also to familiarize you with two key terms. So the emissions that are included in this inventory include, firstly, what we call stationary emissions. And the term stationary can be used to refer to both energy and emissions, and it refers to either the energy used or the emissions that come from heating and cooling buildings and doing things that require energy within those buildings, but nothing to do with transportation. That's what's left out of here. So it's primarily heating and cooling buildings, and then plug use within those buildings. So electricity, as well as appliances and larger scale machinery that would be getting its energy from the grid through the buildings. Transportation would include all of the vehicles and planes and trains that I mentioned earlier. Agriculture can include both energy-based sources and non-energy-based sources. So this is the second distinction I wanted to point out here. Energy-based emissions refers to any situation in which you burn a combustible, or in which you combust a fossil fuel and release greenhouse gases in order to get energy. Non-energy based emissions refers to situations where chemicals are just released due to some process, or just due to being released by people into the atmosphere, and those chemicals themselves are greenhouse gases. So non-energy based emissions would include the methane that comes naturally out of a landfill, but it would also include industrial processes where you have industry that are making products that off-gas greenhouse gases. Some of those are very powerful greenhouse gases. So those non-energy based includes those types of things. Then we have both energy and non-energy based in the agriculture category. The energy based would be for things like tractors and machinery operating within agriculture, and non-energy based would actually account for the manure and also the crop processing and handling and so on, and the management thereof. Waste and wastewater, there are several sources of emissions that come from that category. First of all, as I already mentioned, landfills will emit methane if that methane isn't captured. Secondly, wastewater, the treatment of it produces, the word is escaping me now. And the only word that's coming to my mind now is sludge. That's not the right word. That's not the technical word.
Biosolids.
There we go. Thank you, Chris. Biosolids, that's right. That also release greenhouse gases. And it also takes energy to process wastewater and prepare it to be released back into the environment. So the energy that it takes to clean that wastewater is also a source of emissions. Then we have fugitive emissions, which refers to cases where natural gas leak out of the system. And there are other smaller examples of fugitives from other types of energy sources where the gas is actually released just through the system itself. And then the consumption-based emissions that I talked about earlier. Maybe I should stop there. Sarah, do you want me to stop or do you want me to continue to the end?
We do have several questions that have come up. So if you feel like you can address those questions, that would be great.
Okay. Let's see. Would you mind reading them to me actually, so I don't have to close my screen?
Sure, absolutely. So Laura asks, are we double counting transportation in that case? I'm not sure what the "in that case" refers to. So Laura, if you want to expand that.
Actually, just look at Ray's question below. I think we're kind of duplicating. So due to the overlap between consumption and transportation, how do we separate?
Oh.
But I think you answered that. Because with this description of energy versus non-energy, for me, that answers the question. I don't know about if Ray needs more.
Yeah, transportation is interesting. Ray, did you want to add anything to that?
I guess from my standpoint, just making sure that transportation is seen as the largest category. Seems like if there's an overlap between the two, then consumption or transport of goods would mean there's more for transportation since it's a overlap in the two categories. And so I just want to make sure that we're showing them proportional to how much they're actually being used, because transportation is the largest category in that sense.
Yeah, yes, that's very true. Yes, and there are very clear rules when you do an inventory about where you place the transportation emissions in that case. So you follow the boundary of the city and you account for, or of the county or of the jurisdiction that you're dealing with. And you account for that as being within the county and falling within the transportation category. If things are being shipped in from externally and are falling into the consumption-based area, then their transportation from the boundary out is considered within the consumption category. So there is a cutoff there and they should not be double counted.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then the next question from Dave is the definition of the fugitive category, fugitive emissions.
Yes, and actually, I don't think I described that one very well. Chris, could you give a better description of that one, fugitive emissions?
Sure. Yeah. So the fugitive emissions, there's a number of different fugitive emissions that we capture. So one example is the distribution of natural gas. So as they're going through compression stations and things like that, there's the system is not completely sealed, so natural gas is leaking in those places. The production of gasoline. There's some emissions associated with that, even like the electricity generation has some losses and some emissions associated with that. So those would be considered kind of fugitive emissions. So emissions that are kind of generated from our activity but aren't directly related to the activity that you're doing. Does that help answer the question? Cool.
Yeah, the thumbs up. Excellent. So another question, this one from Dan, was the 2018 is based upon a model, correct? Has anyone reviewed the assumptions of the model in detail as an independent check of land use and building types?
Well, I guess so. The base year was calibrated based on the Clackamas County inventory. So all of our outputs and like energy and emissions consumption is within a couple of percentage point of error between the two main, and the errors being generated by different methodologies for generating those. So in that sense, that's our calibration point, and we're matching that, and so we're fairly confident that we're capturing the essence of the county in that way, and that has been reviewed, internally by us and with the Clackamas project team as well. I don't know if that
could I add to that just a little to the question. The reason I had asked it, I watched the video and it talked about using the Metro model for some different elements, and just noting that Metro is only a portion of Clackamas County, and so there's a big portion of Clackamas County outside of Metro. So, just noting that and calibrating that initial model, that was my question. So
yeah, so obviously we're only using the zones that are, or the traffic, the transportation patterns within the county, and and ignoring the other parts. Well, partially because we also do include external trips as far as our personal use transportation modeling goes. So some of the trips that originate in Clackamas and leave, and also some that originate outside and come in, especially for things like employment and schooling. There's the boundary between in the northwest region obviously is pretty tied to a lot of areas that are outside the county. So there's definitely a lot of cross-boundary trips that we're including in our modeling as well.
Another question is, in what categories do you account for concrete production?
Well, so there's no concrete manufacturing that I'm aware of in Clackamas County, unless I missed it while we were doing the modeling. Those are rough. Like the consumption-based modeling is based on basically some pretty rough, not rough, but broad, I guess was a better term, intensities of energy use or emissions generation from certain activities. As you can imagine, understanding how the whole energy system that goes into the consumption of one item, never mind hundreds of thousands of items that we're using, is quite data heavy and complex. So whether it's 100% accounted for or not, I can't say, but definitely there'll be some impacts of that as part of the construction. The construction intensity we use for the consumption-based modeling.
Yeah, it's not just construction, it's transportation. So I mean, concrete is produced anytime you're paving a road or building most structures. And I don't remember the exact stats, but you can estimate how much CO2 you produce per road mile. So that could be part of the non-energy based transportation, or it could be considered elsewhere, but it does add up, and there's concrete produced everywhere.
Yeah, concrete is definitely a heavy energy user and emitter for sure. I would say.
I'm not talking about the energy used. I'm talking about it's energy, and it's also simply what goes into the concrete.
Yep.
And that process. So it's a combination, but it's very common.
I would say we're not capturing that perfectly for sure.
And then just to get through the questions that have been asked, we've got, I think, 2 more. Since wastewater uses energy for processing, why is energy-based not checked as well under that category?
It's a good point. It may be, Chris, you tell me how the protocol had you handle it, but it may be that the energy used was included in the stationary emissions for the building for wastewater, or I made a mistake and it should have been checked off as well. So there is some discretion in how you complete the inventory. And so it has to be counted, but it may have been put in one of those 2 categories.
Yeah, that would be counted as a building type of operation. So when we're talking about wastewater, that's the actual, the outside of the building, like cleaning the actual wastewater and handling of the waste, and then the building, sorry, is kind of handled as part of this, under the commercial kind of municipal categorizations, county level categorizations.
Great, thank you. And then the last question we have before you can move on with your planned presentation is from Bill Avison. Do you know what percentage of carbon dioxide Clackamas County emits versus the state or national percentage?
You mean the portion of the national total that Oregon is responsible for, or the Clackamas County is responsible for? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, just roughly, how big of an impact does Clackamas County have versus some of the other major counties in the state? And then how does that relate to national? I mean, I don't know if you go that far into the weeds with the numbers, but.
Oh, no, we certainly can. That's not difficult to figure out. I don't know the number offhand, but we can look it up unless, Chris, you happen to know it.
I don't know it off the top of my head. No.
We'll check while we keep going through the presentation and we'll get it for you. We'll figure it out. Okay. Any other questions, Sarah, or can I? Great. Oops. All right, so let's take a look then at the projecting forwards then from that 2018 inventory to see what your business as usual scenario would look like. So business as usual, just as a reminder, is taking what we've learned from the 2018 profile that we've developed in that inventory and projecting it forwards for the next few decades to 2050, which is it's an arbitrary target, but it's a target that most of the world is using when it comes to reaching a necessary level of emission reductions. We adjust what we see in the 2018 inventory based on a lot of information that we had your county staff running around and collecting for us frantically at the very beginning of the project. All of the demographic projections, as well as land development plans, new construction in terms of whether they're expecting to see more multiple unit residential buildings, more commercial buildings, and exactly what locations within the county they expect to see those buildings being developed. Also regulations that are pertinent to particularly to energy efficiency and energy use, and to the sources of fuel that will be used for that energy. Electricity generation can come from many different sources of fuels, and depending on what combination are being used, you get a certain emissions factor for your electricity. And so we needed to look at, I think we looked at the federal sources to get that number for you, projected all the way out to 2050. And then county strategies and policies that are already in place that are having an impact or will have an impact on emissions. We also look at climatic trends that we are aware of. So there's an increase in temperature that's already occurring, and that will affect how much heat you need. And it'll also affect how much cooling you'll need, as we were talking about in our little breakout group. So we need to take that into account as we look forwards, that you're going to need more energy for cooling and less energy for heating. So we reflect that on an annual basis through the model. And then we also need to look at trends within the county of uptake for new technologies as well as new behaviors that will affect your energy use and your emissions. So we take all of that information into account to project out the business as usual or the business as planned scenario. So we're going to look firstly at energy use, because it's important that you don't only look at reducing your emissions, but that you also look at reducing the energy that you use. If you don't do that, you can end up over relying on single sources or very few sources of energy in the future, which can put a strain on individual providers. For example, people often talk about electrifying everything. And you would find, I think, pretty quickly that your electricity suppliers could be overwhelmed with demand if you didn't also make an effort to reduce the amount of energy that you're needing initially. So it's important to look at energy use first and then drop your emissions. So let's look at how your energy use looks into the future. Between 2018 and 2050, the general trend is a little bit of a drop and then a rise, up to be about a 6% increase in energy use. This tracks not closely with your population increase. Your population is expected to grow quite a bit more. And the fact that it doesn't track right against the population increase tells you that the energy efficiency measures that are already put in place are going to make a difference. They're going to help this curve be flatter rather than as steep as your population growth will be. Chris, is this where you were going to take over?
Yeah, sure. So we do try to represent all the activity as spatially as possible, so we can understand well, just where the activity is happening and get a good sense of where we can maybe focus some of our actions, or even understand, you know, equity aspects, and especially like a big area like Clackamas, you know, which you have kind of lots of urban, lots of rural. It's interesting to see kind of where that energy and emission use is being used. So this is looking at total stationary energy use. So this is excluding it's excluding any of the consumption. Well, when we get to emissions, it would be excluding anything kind of like consumption-based emissions, and transportation. Transportation obviously is a tricky one because it moves around, so it's hard to put it into one place. You can say, you know, it's all tied to origin or destination, so there are those possibilities. But right now, this is just looking at stationary energy use, and so you can see over time. Not much change as you saw in the graph. The graph stays fairly flat, so it's kind of hard to see any real changes in the energy use. And this one's a little misleading. If you go to the next slide, Moria, there's an energy density map where we're taking the energy use and dividing by the hectare of these individual tile or individual zones that you're seeing here. So you can see what you would probably expect more is the more denser areas with the smaller zones are using a lot more energy than the bigger rural areas out into the kind of southeast side of the county. And then similar to energy use, the emissions are increasing as well. Yeah, a little bit of different curve, but not much of a different story there. You know, more energy use, obviously, the more emissions. Well, depending on the source of energy, but since in this business as usual, where there's not a lot of conversion away from fossil fuels, it's kind of more still the status quo. The emissions are growing with the population as well. On a per capita though, because as Moria mentioned, the line is not going as steep as the population increase. So the things that you are doing are decreasing or making that slope not quite as steep. So emissions per capita is decreasing, but as you can see, they're still not getting just to where we need to go as far as reaching targets to kind of mitigate the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. So a little bit more work for us to do as part of the low carbon modeling, which we'll be, you know, working towards here in the future. So again, looking at, so that was energy we were looking at before on the maps. Now the stationary emissions. So again, you can see, you know, where those emissions are spread out and how they're changing over time. And again, this is a little misleading because it's just looking at the amount of emissions within, you know, in some of these bigger areas. There's a lot of emissions, but there's a small, you know, or a big area of land that we're talking about. So if you go to the next slide, please, Moria, we can look at the emissions density. So again, metric tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare of land within those zones. And again, you can see kind of it all bunched up in the top northwest corner there, where a lot of the urbanization is occurred compared to the rural areas of the county.
Okay, shall we stop there in case there are more questions? Has anything else come up, Sarah?
I think we've had 2 questions come up. Let me scroll back up. So we had one question about just units of measurement. So MMBTUs are millions of BTUs, not clear why it's labeled as thousands in the previous graph. So I think that was several graphs back, but thousands of MMBTU was
Yeah, so that's
raising the question.
thousands of millions of BTUs, mostly just to make the access a little bit more readable. So we just divide the number by 1,000, so it's not like a big string of zeros behind it. It's kind of confusing, I know, but makes the numbering a little bit more readable, in my opinion. So it's thousands of millions of BTUs.
Thank you.
We're talking about big numbers here, so it's hard to get a perfect shorthand for them.
And then the other question that we have is, if a business has more than one location, are you combining all the business location data into the main location or keeping the data separated for all of the business locations?
So we don't have information by business, it's more by building type. So we do use, the way we got that information spatially is from the county's assessment records. So it doesn't tell us kind of the name of the business or necessarily the type of the business. Usually it gives us a categorization of kind of a class of building type. So commercial, kind of warehouse, or some general ones like that. So we don't really know where businesses are per se as far as like the name of the business, but we do know roughly kind of what type of building use is happening in those areas, and that's what we go by.
And then we had one other question come up during that, which was, can you explain how the zones within the county map are designated?
So those are traffic zones, which are which come from the traffic modeling that was mentioned earlier by Metro. And usually we like to use traffic zones in our energy and emission modeling because of that overlap, and it helps us with the transportation modeling that we get to determine transportation energy and emission use. And usually a big enough size or a nice size for us to manage things.
And that's it for questions for now. Thanks.
All right. So this slide gives us a chance to look at your 2018 emissions versus your 2050 emissions. And so the inner circle represents the proportions of different sectors contributing to your emissions in 2018. The outer circle represents the proportions of what we're projecting for 2050. And there are three areas that I think are noteworthy that I thought we should look at. So the first one is waste, up at just left of center on the top. In 2018, it represented 1% of your emissions, which I already mentioned is very good relative to many other jurisdictions that we've worked with. However, it's rising significantly by 2050. A lot of that is due to the increase in population, because we projected the increase in waste to run proportionally to the increase in population. There, however, are many opportunities there to address that increase in emissions, and also to even turn it into something that could be a moneymaker for the county. There are many opportunities to turn waste of various types into fuels, and particularly into fuels that are going to be in demand in the future because they're considered renewable fuels. So it's an area to look at, both in terms of needing to take action and also in terms of looking at it as an opportunity, because there's some very interesting opportunities going on there, and they're becoming increasingly common all over the world, and they're well practiced and they work well. So we'll be exploring that more with you as we keep going and looking at your low carbon actions. The second area I wanted to point out is transportation. The numbers that you see on the slide there, 24% is the portion of emissions that came from transportation in 2018, and 20% is the amount or the proportion in 2050. However, that's still a very large portion of your total emissions. So that remains a large area that needs to be addressed. Fortunately, however, there are a lot of opportunities to change vehicle behaviors and vehicle fuels and people's behaviors, and switching more to shared transportation and to active transportation. So that'll also be an area that we'll encourage you to focus on as we keep looking at things. And then the biggest area of all in 2018 continues to be the biggest area in 2050, and that's your consumption-based emissions. And I congratulate you for tracking this stuff at a county level, because there are not many jurisdictions that we work with that are already in a position to be able to track their consumption-based emissions as well as you guys do. And that gives you a step ahead really in getting a handle on those and looking at what can be done to change them. So you're already ahead of the game, and it's good because it makes up a big portion of everybody's emissions. We see similar trends in other communities that do have consumption-based inventories.
Moria, may I just jump in there on that?
You may.
I just wanted to give credit where credit is due to some extent. So one of the ways in which Oregon as a state is fairly innovative is that we do have a state level consumption-based emissions inventory. And so, you know, we and anyone else at the local level in Oregon would rely heavily upon the state's work, which is, you know, of course, overseen by the DEQ to describe more in a qualitative way what our consumption-related emissions are. So, thanks.
Yeah, that's great. And it means you have very good data to work with, which is something that we envy in Canada. Our data is not nearly as good to be able to develop consumption-based inventories. So you're in a good spot. Okay, now looking more particularly at the trends of your emissions, I've removed the consumption-based wedge because it's so big that it kind of blocks out everything else that's happening. So looking at all of the other sectors that you're still producing emissions from between now and 2050, you can see that there is a fall, a drop, partially because we've removed the consumption-based, but you also get a sense of how there are ripples in different sectors, and other areas remain relatively level over time. Some of these ripply parts reflect areas where there are changes in policy that we know are coming, or improvements in building energy efficiency standards that tend to come in about every 5 years. When that happens, you tend to see a bit of a drop, and then a leveling, and then a drop, and then a leveling. So that's some of what you're seeing in this graph here.
And a lot of it too is also the grid emissions factor projections that we got from PGE.
Right, yes, because those are generally falling, but there is also some bumpiness right in the middle of the timeline as well, where there will be little rises in the emissions factors and then drops again. So it's also paralleling that. Oops. So looking specifically at building emissions, because buildings are responsible for a large portion of your emissions, if you add them all together. There are a few things that are going on here that are causing a decrease that are worth noting, particularly in the residential area. The BAP modeling accounts for the fact that a certain portion of your existing multi-unit residential, I believe it is, do have some retrofits that are done every year, and that accomplishes an improvement in total emissions over time. So that's the main reason for seeing this drop. I feel like there was a second reason. Chris, do you remember?
Well, new buildings are being built more efficiently over time as well. So even though you're adding new buildings to the area, the building code is being stricter.
Yeah, that's right.
And then also to the heating, like Moria mentioned earlier, we are tracking heating and cooling degree days, and so as heating degree days actually go down, in some ways that's helping us, and cooling degree days are going up, but they're not going up nearly as much as heating degree days are coming down. So you're seeing the benefits of climate change in this, which arguably benefits, I guess.
It's ironic, yes. The total increase in temperature that we see for Clackamas County, I believe, is 1.6 degrees between 2020 and 2050. That's what's being forecast right now. Transportation emissions. So the really exciting drop in this picture, I assume you can all tell right away, has to do with air traffic. And that reflects the fact that we all had to stop flying, particularly during COVID in 2020, which made a lovely dip in everybody's emissions. However, they're forecasting that the official forecast from aviation industry was that we would return to previous levels by 2024, but that seems to be coming back faster than they expected. So we have hit a middle ground at 2023 here. We would be resuming the previous curve that we had for an increase in flights and in jet fuel. And that's a real problem. Jet fuel is a tricky one to get rid of in terms of fuels that are causing emissions problems. The other categories there isn't as much of a dramatic change, although you will notice that cars, emissions from cars appear to be dropping. That's partially because the modes or the types of vehicles that are anticipated to be owned by people in Clackamas County is switching more into the light trucks and SUVs and that category of vehicle, and that's represented on this top purple line here. So some of these car owners are switching over to be light truck users. And the general decrease in both of those lines reflects the fact that fuel efficiency standards continue to improve as well. So we are seeing small but important benefits from the improvement in fuel standards.
And we're also introducing some electrification of vehicles in there. Well, I think it's like 100% of new vehicle sales by 2035 will be electric, and that's changing all the time, obviously. But yeah, so around there you were seeing the addition of electric vehicles. Not a lot, but some. And
on the bottom we have trains running at about the same level of emissions right to the end, and we also have transit looking very similar at the end of the time period. Now this slide, I don't want to look at all of this information too carefully, but I wanted to show it to you just to demonstrate that even if the line doesn't look like it's rising, I'm going to back up one slide here. Even if these lines look relatively level, if you compare the beginning point and the end point, there are significant differences that happen along the way. So for example, total aviation traffic, I already mentioned, is rising significantly between 2020 and 2050. So we'll see increased emissions because of that. Here's the drop in car ownership and use, which is offset somewhat by the light trucks staying closer to level. And this is also accounted for again by the improving fuel efficiency standards. Many of these other things remain basically the same between 2020 and 2050, although there are some improvements in the heavy truck traffic, which would also be due to electrification of those vehicles and possibly switching to hydrogen vehicles as well. And here we are at the waste story with a nice dramatic graph on the right-hand side. So on the left-hand side, we can see 2018 and 2050, the composition of the waste that's expected. And you can see that your compostable waste is going up significantly, which is feedstock for renewable natural gas. So there's a definite opportunity there to take that compostable material and turn it into a fuel that can be sold. And then we also have, Chris, what's in the other category? Everything that isn't paper, plastic, or metal?
Yeah, mostly like ICI, there's some ICI stuff, and yeah.
So that would be?
Oh, like from construction, I think there's some I can't remember all of them. I don't know off the top of my head.
It's ICI is industrial, commercial,
yeah.
And
I don't know what the other I stands for.
I'm sorry, we should remember those categories. We call it ICI and we forget. Institutional, commercial, and something else.
Could probably industrial then if we're thinking one's institutional.
Yes. Plastic and metals, the green category here, can also be recycled, obviously, and then that can feed into a circular economy, which is also something that's going to be an important part of reaching these goals, making better use of recycled materials more exhaustively than we've been doing so far. But on the right-hand side, you can see that due to the growth in your population, you are still going to have a significant increase in your landfill size and your need to hold waste in a landfill. So that is something that's going to become more of an issue for you than it has been so far. And as it rises to fill that sort of 3% of your total emissions rather than just the 1% that it fills right now. So we'll look at that with you when we talk about the low carbon actions. And that is where our presentation ends. So if you had any other questions, we can take those at this time.
All right, so I will go ahead and start with the questions that are in the chat, and then we can open the floor for verbal in the moment questions. So the first question that I have tracked, and because I am pulling them out of my chat to make sure I don't lose them, I don't have the names. So if there are follow-up questions, we'll just open that up. So the first question was, does Clackamas County have an input-output economic model usually provided by OSU?
I do not know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I was going to let somebody from Clackamas County
Yeah.
answer that.
And I would say that while certain, from my knowledge, certain departments may have that, it was not incorporated into this modeling. We used the DEQ model that that Evan referenced.
Is the question
methodology
specific to the consumption portion of the inventory? Because I know that that's generally what goes into consumption-based inventories.
I will let whoever asked that question. Yeah.
Yes is the answer to that question. It comes out of the consumption piece. OSU for most counties does an exhaustive tracking of all dollar inputs and outputs and how they go between sectors. And they update them every 5 to 7 years. I don't know if they do them for the urban counties, which is why I asked the question. But if a relatively recent IO model exists for dollar flows among sectors, then it would be extremely useful when we go forward to try to find ways to reduce emissions in the consumption sector, knowing where more of that activity is by sector rather than just having this giant consumption sector and not being able to, burrow down. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. So if the county staff can look into where that information comes from and some of the background to it, we can incorporate some of that into our low carbon work.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Right. The next question is, do building emissions over time assume most people will return to the office after COVID is over?
I think they did. I don't think we made any changes for transportation. Did we, Chris?
Yeah, that's kind of a tricky one. Things are changing so quickly, and we're opening and closing and opening and closing. It's hard to keep our tabs on that one. So kind of just kind of thinking it's a temporary change and assuming that things are kind of going to go back to normal. We kind of brushed over that in those years as far as transportation and building energy goes.
Okay. Next question is, if it's mandated that air conditioning be included in new construction affordable housing, does this modeling include the impact for those requirements in new construction? And since it's new, will it be adapted?
I'd have to go check what we have for the ratio of heating of buildings that have cooling systems in there. We don't differentiate between kind of affordable housing versus non-affordable housing in the modeling. But I know that the cooling kind of adoption is fairly high in that area. I don't know exactly what it is, but I could check that and get back to you.
And the next question is, does this graph also represent electricity generation emissions for EV charging or just the transport emissions? I'm not sure which graph that is.
Well, so the electricity used by any EVs would come from in this case, would come from the grid unless we had local solar generation. It could be a mixture of both. In this case, it would be mostly from the grid. So that would include the electricity generation emissions, yes.
And we've got more coming in chat, so I'm trying to track. Okay, how were forest fire emissions built into agriculture?
They were not, unfortunately. We don't have a forest model in here, and we don't, we don't model in forest fires. So unfortunately, that's not being captured in this modeling exercise, but is an important consideration for sure.
Another question is, if we are modeling more electric vehicles, does the waste tonnage include the batteries that aren't currently recyclable?
The modeling is not like it doesn't account for the consumption of those types of things directly, no. So, but it is, as you say, it's something that would need to be considered for sure as a practical implementation of high EV adoption.
Okay. And then we've got, for non-metal recyclables, wouldn't the projections be largely dependent on economic factors for those markets, which would be increasingly uncertain the farther out we project? Are the modeling assumptions based on current recycling markets?
Yeah, yes, they would be increasingly uncertain the further out you go. And no, they're not based on only on current, they are based on industry forecasts. And it would depend on which particular sector you'd be curious about as to what we would use, unless we use one general one, Chris, do you happen to remember?
Well, the recycling capacity is just based on the recycling facilities that are already in, so from the county, we got the amount of waste that's generated and the amount of waste that's recycled. And so that's what we're going by. It's not really market driven necessarily from our point of view.
I was thinking maybe the question related to my comment that there's a potential profit in producing renewable natural gas from waste.
That it wasn't that, it was the recycled commodities outside of metal, where metal circular and everything else is, you tend to lose a lot in each round, plus a lot of it's dependent on who's taking it elsewhere.
Yes, that is true. Yeah.
Okay, and then the last question that we have in chat so far is, have you modeled the existing carbon sequestration capacity of Clackamas County?
Yeah, so basically the method or the assumption that we take is, at the base year, the level of sequestration is at where it's at, and the emissions that we're producing are kind of above and beyond what's being sequestered, because there's already trees and grasses and things in the community. And then what we can do going forward is, if we wanted to show, the reforestation of a certain area, or urban forestation or things like that, we would add extra sequestration that would take away from current emissions that are currently being generated. So yes, and kind of no.
And Bill, I'll just add to that, although this is not a county-wide forestry initiative, our forestry division has been looking at carbon sequestration opportunities on the forest lands owned by Clackamas County. That's of course a small slice of the acreage of forest in our community, but it is something that we've been looking at to the extent it's under our control.
And
I just want to make sure I understood the statement that was mentioned there regarding carbon sequestration and how it's quantified with regards to the overall emissions. So are you saying that gross, let's just paint a simple example. Let's say gross overall emissions are 100 tons. And let's say carbon sequestration is 10 tons. Are you saying that what you're presenting on your graphs is 100 minus 10 or 90 tons? Are you still presenting gross emissions, and that somewhere you're going to show how carbon sequestration currently in the future is minimizing those emissions?
Yeah, so yeah, we're showing like 100 tons. We're saying that 10 tons is kind of built into the equation already, and we're emitting like 100 tons still. Like, you already have the trees there. They're not, you're not planting, you haven't planted any new trees necessarily, or enough to make a difference in that year. And so you're sequestering all you can already, and what you're emitting is kind of above and beyond your sequestration abilities. And then going forward, we can add more sequestration capacity in the form of trees or whatever, and to subtract from that kind of 100 tons going forward. You don't like that, David?
I guess what I was thinking is, sequestration can be variable. I mean, you could, obviously everything's variable, but I mean, let's say your emissions are increasing over time, but your sequestration could increase or decrease depending whether you've got large forest fires like we had last year where 140,000 acres were vanished, or a pretty good part, or if you had public policy to incentivize sequestration. So it seems to me that there should be a gross number that is reported. Let's say you live in a desert, you're going to have an overall gross number of emissions, and then how you deal with those emissions over time can then be factored in, and then we could understand better and more completely as a bigger picture how, it's like a supply and demand equation, right? You're supplying or you're emitting a certain amount of emissions, but then you're also controlling that to a certain degree, which can also be variable. It would help me anyway understand what the county is doing as a whole and how those buffering or mitigating effects are counteracting that, and how that could possibly be varied, either increased or decreased.
Yeah.
We can certainly add that into our ongoing work to give you a sense of that part of the reason that we can incorporate it, and it can be incorporated into inventories. Not many jurisdictions do that, generally because it's sad to say, but the impact is not as big as everyone would like it to be. So it wouldn't even really be visible on most graphs. However, it's still a very positive thing to do from a community perspective and from many other perspectives in terms of saving energy, filtering water, and so on. There are many, many co-benefits to planting those trees as well. So it is an important action. It doesn't make much of a difference right at the stage that we're at right now. You wouldn't see much of a wedge at all for that sequestration. But it can definitely be blended in, and Clackamas County could definitely add that data if they have access to it to their inventories in the future, so that you could track that more carefully.
Yeah.
Okay, so
go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say our base assumption basically is there's no real change in the forest abundance in the county. And obviously, you could do some sensitivities where, if a forest fire happened and you wiped out a whole bunch of trees in the county, how that would affect or how that would make the emissions change. But we haven't done that as part of the business plan either.
I noticed that Bill has his hand raised, and we have about 1 minute until we're scheduled to take a break. So, Bill, would you like to share your question or comment briefly?
There we go. Get the mute off. Yeah, I actually have some data on sequestration national, and I think it includes Oregon that certainly could share with the team. But David's point of keeping the data separate, I think, plays into our model and our recommendations at the end. That it is going to be a tool, I think, that can be used in the future. And so I think that we should really look at those numbers closely, and I'll share that website. It's very well done, and it's national data that they developed on forest sequestration. So anyway.
Wonderful. Yes, please do. We'd appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. All right. So as we head into a break, I just want to make a kind of a general overview comment, which is that one of the things I appreciate about this presentation is that it helps give us a little bit of insight into ways in which, we are working in a world with limited data. And so modeling and, our inventory can help paint like a picture of where we are at, but it's not, it can't be the end all be all right now, in the sense that we have to just acknowledge that it's a tool that's helpful to us. But modeling won't capture every little piece of activity in Clackamas County. And building on that too, I want to say that that's something that this task force could discuss. If there is a need for better data, if there is a need for actions that maybe don't directly reduce emissions, but they help us understand the picture better, that could be the purview of recommendations by this task force. Does that make sense? Hey, we'd like to make a recommendation because we just don't know enough about this zone, and so we need, we would like to say that we need more data in this area. That's something that could be discussed. Okay, with that, thank you so much for the presentation. Moria and Chris, and we're scheduled to take a 5-minute break. We're 2 minutes behind, so try to be quick if you can, but we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Well, let's resume. So what's next is some additional discussion from our consulting team around what's next. Then Sarah will be revisiting the prioritization criteria with you, and then we will transition to a public comment period. Now, we are interested in your further feedback and impressions on the business as planned presentation that we just received. And so we will post in Basecamp some sort of reflection questions about it, like what was new or surprising? Was there anything in there that felt exciting or daunting, etc.? So more engagement to happen, and we would encourage you to visit Basecamp to give us more information and feedback on the business's plan presentation so far. With that, Moria, I think we're turning it back to you.
Very briefly, we received your request for information about other sort of county level climate action plans that we have worked on and developed. And we've started looking into the ones that would be very useful for you. And we've pulled a few of them together, but we haven't put them into a format that would be ready to present to you today. And we also need to make sure that the jurisdictions that are responsible for them are comfortable with us sharing them in this kind of a format. I'm sure they will be, but just out of politeness, we need to check with them. So we'll bring that information back to you probably at a future session, and we will make sure that it's available probably on the Basecamp website as well. So my apologies for not being able to fill you in on that beforehand, but we'll regain our time in the schedule now.
If we have a couple minutes, I guess I could just kind of briefly show you geographically some of the areas that we worked on to give you a sense of kind of the different places that we worked at that could be similar or have similar challenges to Clackamas. That is of interest.
We certainly have the time, so yeah.
All right, it won't take long, but I'll just share my screen really quickly here. So all of these are Canadian context, but I don't think that that matters so much. The first one we did is the city of Caledon, which you can see here is near Toronto and part of the bigger region of Peel. Very rural area, close to a major kind of urban population. Have a couple of different little kind of towns within them. So that's kind of been an interesting one. We did lots of kind of rural space similar to what Clackamas has. We also did the Halifax regional model, which is on the very east of Canada over here. So Halifax is pretty, well, the capital of Nova Scotia, dense population in the middle, but very large area of kind of rural, unpopulated areas, again, similar to what Clackamas has kind of in that. The regional municipality of Durham, which pretty close to Caledon, actually, just on the other side of Toronto. So you have some major city centers down by Lake Ontario, and then lots of kind of rural space up on the northern part of it. And then finally, over back in Nova Scotia, kind of down in this western portion, we modeled an energy economic plan for this kind of a large, kind of unpopulated, but lots of little towns area around that. So we have lots of experience working with areas that have both, kind of dense urban populations and also urban kind of rural mixes going forward. So as Maria said, we would be happy to share kind of those plans with you guys to see, what actions and what things those communities are looking at doing to tackle this challenge that we're all looking at.
Great. Thank you for that. Is there anything else, Moria or Chris, that you wanted to share before we shift over to the next agenda item?
No, I think we're okay to roll through with you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for all of that great information. It is a lot to process, and I know we'll be working with that throughout our entire plan development. So it's great to get that started. So last meeting, we introduced our prioritization criteria and we walked through it a bit, but we wanted to give some more time. And so we're actually going to break into small groups. We'll go back to Mural. So once you are in your small groups, we sent out the link ahead of time, and also the staff members who are in the breakout rooms will share that link so you can access Mural again. And so we're going to spend actually a fair amount of time just giving the CATF some more time to process and discuss and better understand the prioritization criteria so that we can make any final refinements, make sure that what we're saying is as clear as possible, because next meeting, we're going to start applying this prioritization criteria. So this is sort of our last chance to really dig in and make sure that we've got a solid understanding before we start working with actions, which is very exciting, I think, to a lot of us. So one of the things that we're going to ask is for different groups to actually start at different ends of the list. And part of that is just so that there's not quite so much activity on Mural and so much overlap, but also to make sure that we're addressing all of the criteria and having good conversation on all of them. So we're asking groups number 1 and 2 to start at the top, and groups number 3 and 4 to start at the bottom. And so that'll be based on your breakout room number. And then we're going to come back together at 3:25. We'll do a really brief just sort of summary, and then we will shift over to public comment. So there will be staff support in every room as we have these discussions, but mostly it's just about really continuing to work through these different concepts. All right, and we should be. That was a good conversation. I know my group had a really exciting conversation. We got through all of the criteria, which was a big lift. So thank you all so much for your work in that. All of these breakout rooms are recorded, so feel free to view what other groups have gone through. And we will be looking at all of those different comments and finalizing the criteria language to start applying it and using it starting next meeting. Okay, and now I will pass things off to Katie and Garrett for public comment.
Sure. So we are going to use the raise your hand feature if folks have, if anyone from the public has a question. So you can find that usually in the lower portion of your screen. If you'd like to speak during public comment, we just ask that you raise your hand and then I will call on you for your turn. So we'll open the floor. And it doesn't look like anyone's raising their hand, Sarah, today, so I don't think we have any comment.
Okay, well, in that case, I will pass things off to Evan to wrap us up.
Okay. Well, thank you all. There was a question earlier about the, I think basically it's about the relative contribution to carbon emissions from the county or versus Oregon or the state or the, excuse me, or the country, or maybe global. And that's something that we can look into and describe. I wanted to make sure that that was acknowledged. Last time I looked at that a couple of years ago, I looked for a date where there was a consistent comparison point across time. And this answer is not as a percentage, but Oregonians were averaging around 10 metric tons per capita of CO2 equivalent emissions around 2015 or so. American residents at large, 16.5 metric tons per capita. The global average was about 5. So Oregonians are about twice the global average of carbon emissions on a per person basis. This was, again, a few years back, but maybe that gives you just a general sense of where we stand in the contribution to this challenge. Now with that, we have to look ahead to meeting number 4. And one of the things that we would like to ask you to do is to visit Basecamp and respond to prompts that you would find there. And Sarah, I do want to just ask real quick, are there specific prompts that you want them to be looking for in particular?
So we just have the standing prompt of the bio, which most people have responded to. So just a few folks. And if anyone is having trouble finding that or navigating that, let me know. I'm happy to help with that. And then, as you had mentioned, we'll add some prompts with today's content around the business as usual. So those will be some new prompts that'll show up probably tomorrow.
Thank you, Sarah. So our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, September 9th from 1 to 4 p.m. And as we wrap up, we would invite you again to put in the chat what worked for you today. What difference would you like to see going forward in meetings, if anything? Just continue to provide us with feedback on how we're doing. Of course, chat's not the only place for you to do that, but if you've got some thoughts as you depart from the meeting today, we would really welcome them. So that concludes our meeting, and staff will remain here for a few more moments, I'm sure. And if you don't have any comments to add in the chat on the meeting today, then we look forward to seeing you next time.